See. All right. Well, thank you for joining us today. Today we're going to be talking about the series of posts that I'd recently written for Substack, a series called On the Gods. And this is something that's really important for the future of Platonism and really contemporary Platonism today, and moving us from a point of being more of a philosophers club or study groups for people who are really into Plato and want to dive deep into the sources, and moving into a more community based, a more religiously focused community that is more dedicated towards devotion and worship, and not just talking about high level metaphysics and philosophy and things like that. So today we've brought on Ethan to ask a couple questions about that and just explain this different perspective of looking at Platonism. It's really something I'm calling more classical Platonism and religious Platonism, as opposed to Platonism as a purely intellectual and rational kind of exercise that mostly exists right now in either academic circles in the universities or smaller academic type communities online. So with that, I'll hand it over to Ethan. If you have any opening thoughts or anything you want to throw out there, feel free. And then I think you had some questions as well we were going to jump into.
Yeah, I'd like to just jump right into it. I guess the first thing that really stuck out to me when I started to read this series of articles that you did titled On the Gods, which is very, very appropriate title. And like you mentioned, it's one of those subjects that has been kind of polarizing and has been the center of a lot of contention and debates regarding, how we present this, what are the gods, and I think you open it perfectly by getting right to that question. I think many Platonists can relate to you, or just really pagans in general, where at some point we are faced with that question by an inquirer, someone who's curious about our beliefs, and they ask us just point blank, well, what are the gods? And as Platonists, we get flooded with metaphysical concepts and, trying to figure out, well, how can I relay this in a way that's not, reliant upon heavy philosophical jargon. And I think throughout this series, you do a very good job of just bringing it down to the fundamentals, bringing it right down to Plato, who really isn't overcomplicating anything. So I guess I want to start out by just asking you, well, what are the gods then?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, the gods are divine souls in the simplest way that we can put it. What that means is that they're a soul very much the same way that we are a soul, which is sort of the center of what it means to be a person at some level. So they're personal in that sense, but they are disembodied. They're not in physical bodies, but they are the most supreme souls in the cosmos. And what's more important than just them being that is their function within the cosmos, which is to lead and guide other souls. And we see this in the Timaeus, and we also see this reiterated in Plato's Laws, where he talks about what the function of the gods are and where they come from. And it's very clear that they're created by the demiurge as a way to guide other souls toward back to God, essentially. And so that's really the way that we look at them. They are those divine guides and those souls that are most aligned to God.
So I want to get into specifics from each one of these different articles, which have different titles, and they go into specific subjects surrounding, the gods and the nature of the gods. But before doing so, I wanted to ask just a few basic questions, which I'm often faced with alongside, what are the gods? The next question that usually follows is, well, why do we have to worship gods? Why not just worship God?
Yeah, that's a great question. God for us as Platonists is a much more difficult thing to connect with, because God is in some sense beyond personality. And when we're talking about God as the one, but even God as the demiurge is a bit too big of a concept sometimes for us to relate to on a personal level. In a one way to think of the demiurge might be the ideal of personhood, like personhood itself. But that's a much more difficult thing to wrap our minds around. But we can worship God, and we should worship God. But the way that we connect to that is very often through the gods rather than through God. And reason being is that the gods are more personal. They are souls, where the demiurge isn't necessarily a soul. And so we can relate to a god in that way. We can understand a god. A god can actually help us, guide us, hear prayers, respond to us, and lead us. And we learn by that example that is in them. And they show us these sort of particular pathways back to God rather than us sort of reaching for God directly. So you can kind of think of it as like it's the mediation, it's the bridge that we get to being like God. Plato ultimately tells us in Theaetetus that the purpose of our lives is to become like God, right? So we are going towards that, but the gods are there to help us understand that by giving us more particular ways to understand God and get closer to that kind of virtue that's going to lead us to that perfection.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I found that usually when we look at God in our everyday lives, we're usually already kind of filtering him through a specific kind of person. For a lot of people who ask that question, I think they're really hinting at the kind of biblical view of God, which is already a very specific God, you might say, rather than this kind of, capital G God, who is far more transcendent, like you're getting at. So no, that's great. All right, well, I wanted to move on then into these articles, and the first one, you kind of give a general synopsis of what is to come, and you break down these kind of assumptions that we have within Platonism as modern Platonists, at least, and you really start to kind of prod at those assumptions and get down to the kind of, again, fundamentals of the teachings of Plato and how we actually ground our beliefs and our doctrines, for lack of a better word. So the first one that you really hit on is theology and metaphysics. You allude to it first, and then you get into it deeper later. But if you could just give a kind of general overview of what you've found in the Platonic tradition regarding theology, metaphysics, their distinctions, and what comes from collapsing the two.
That's a great question. Well, one of the things that surprised me perhaps the most was going back to Plato in writing all of this and looking at his understanding of the gods, and also looking at Plato's understanding of metaphysics. And it's very interesting to me that he does not collapse the two together. And so to define, I guess, what I mean by metaphysics and theology here, metaphysics is about that which concerns reality itself. So when we're trying to understand what is reality, those are metaphysical questions. What is being? What is knowledge? What does intelligibility mean in regard to the universe and to us? These are universal questions because ultimately the answers are going to be the same no matter who you are, no matter what religion you're a part of. Now, your religion might obviously filter the way that you think about that answer, but what I mean is being itself, for example, isn't different for a Christian than for a Muslim than for a Buddhist. We're all living in the same reality. We all have the same being. And if we really do believe that there is one God above all, well, there's one God above all. That means that the God that we're looking at, we might view him through a Christian lens or a pagan lens or a Hindu lens, but that God itself, if it's real, is the same. It's not defined by the particular religions that are trying to describe it. So what we get to with that is a separation between metaphysics as a universal framework to understand reality itself and theology as something that is actually much more particular. When we understand that the gods are souls and they're not analogous to metaphysical principles, then we can see that the gods are actually more particular. They're particular to groups of people. They're particular to different religions. And that doesn't mean that the religions cause them, but different religions are basically drawing on different groups of gods and creating religions around them. So the problem that we run into in most modern religions is a collapse of these two principles. And I think some of that is inevitable just because of the way that religions develop, that we're going to basically start understanding the gods that are close to us, that we're engaging with the most. And as we continue to learn more about these universal principles, these universal sort of spiritual realities, let's say, it's natural for us to project our theology onto it. So, for example, you can see in something like Judaism where it does start out, and you said, Yahweh is clearly this particular God to the Hebrews, right? Well, that makes sense that they have this particular relationship, but what ends up happening over time? Well, they end up extrapolating this leader God for themselves into the God of the entire universe for everyone, not just for them. It's not just their God, it's pushed forward into this universalized principle where they say, well, no, actually Yahweh's the God of everyone, which means all the other gods are not as Yahweh is, right? And a lot of religions do this, right? You see the Christians kind of do the same thing with Christ, where they take Christ as their exemplar that they're following, and then they push him ever higher and higher and higher until he's literally rationality itself and the organizing principle of the universe. And so I think it's okay that in some sense that we do that, but we have to be clear that there is actually a separation between these things. Because if we end up pushing, say, Christ to the point where he's the organizing principle of the universe, well, then the natural conclusion is that Christianity is the only real religion. All the other ones are false. And I think that that's the position that's the most untenable, because we look at all of these different religions worldwide and we can see they all are participating in this kind of universal metaphysical reality, but in a very particular way. In the article, I point out that Shiva in Shaivism as the sort of organizing principle, this consciousness at the root of everything, is somewhat analogous to Christ as the Logos. And they're mutually exclusive, right? Either one's true or the other is, unless we take a different approach with metaphysics altogether and say metaphysics is not something that we should theologize or try to attach particular divine personalities to metaphysical principles. We should leave them as metaphysical principles. And if we do, project those personalities onto it at all, we have to understand that it's purely syncretic, right? We're using a name to describe that, but really it is what it is on its own. And it's not exclusively that particular God.
And this really does explain why throughout these Platonic dialogues and just the entire corpus of the Platonic tradition, a lot of the philosophers and sages kind of refrain from directly talking about the gods as they know them throughout their theological tradition, throughout their religious tradition, we might say, and as objects of worship. They more so are talking about metaphysics, and it makes sense now looking back at it and going, oh, that's because they don't collapse the two. They're not saying that Zeus is the metaphysical principle itself of all of reality, like Christians are doing, or Yahwehists are doing with their own God. They are very careful about keeping the two separate so that they can touch upon those areas that are shared and common between traditions and religions, while still preserving their own tradition that is unique to them and best represents them and the uniqueness of their people. So would you say that is what's going on there? That is why they kind of refrain from talking about the gods specifically, using their specific names, but really only when it comes up to kind of tie it back into theology or metaphysics, depending on what they're talking about there.
Yes. Yeah. Short answer, yes. That when it's something that confused me for a really long time, reading different Platonists, like you said, It's you go into reading somebody like Plotinus, for example, and expecting that you're going to get, like a theology where you're going to have all of this explained of who the gods are, what the gods are, how they fit into the whole. And, oh, you almost expect to just hear something like, well, Zeus is the nous. That is what Zeus is. And Aphrodite is the world soul. And this is, you expect to hear all of those things. And Plotinus is really careful about ever doing anything like that. And he does have a few moments where he does attribute particular gods to particular things. And you could say sort of metaphysical structures, but he's very careful to do it in a way that's much more about mythology, where he's explaining that in this particular myth, the god is a stand-in for this metaphysical principle. And so it's very much like what Celestius says, that some myths are metaphysical allegories, right? Some of them are explaining these principles, but they're just using the gods as personalities to help people understand the relationships. And I think in the ancient world, the gods were, a very much like a spiritual lingua franca. Like they were how people could understand these principles more simply. So it made sense for people to use those kind of analogies when we're talking about metaphysical principles. But so much of Platonism is actually moving away from doing that, and primarily is trying to talk about the principles themselves. And that's why that we talk about things like nous and soul and the one, right? We're not trying to collapse those things into theological identities. We're trying to talk about them as they are, as such. And the ancient world was very pluralistic, and so I think that might have something to do with it, that they really looked at spirituality much more like a science than we do now. And it was really the Christians that made the biggest push, I think, to theologize metaphysics, where they wanted to take these metaphysical principles and these ideas that were in Platonism, but they wanted to attach theological identity to them, which essentially you could say Christ coded reality itself for them. So they could go out, and if you decided that you didn't want to be a Christian or you didn't believe in it, it wasn't just that you didn't believe in this one particular cult. It's that you were denying reality itself. You became this person who was, almost like you would say unscientific, right? You're not following the science, if you were doing that back then, because you were denying this reality that they had coded with their theology. So I look at Plato being very careful not to do that, and when he talks about metaphysics, he's mostly talking about the good and the forms, and he doesn't go to say that the gods are the forms. He doesn't say that, these metaphysical things he's talking about, like the good is Zeus. He doesn't do that. He always leaves them as they are, and is actually very hesitant to talk about metaphysics directly much at all. He mostly leads you there through defining what reality isn't, and leaves you to kind of find it for yourself. Like what must reality be if we remove all of the false ideas about what it isn't? That's more of his approach.
Yeah, and the most stark example I can think of this kind of tension between the two, or let's say a distinction between the metaphysics and theology, and Plato wanting to kind of neatly separate them and keep them as distinct, is the Timaeus compared to like the myth and the Phaedrus. Like they are conveying very different stories, very different principles or truths, and they are appropriately like the Phaedrus is appropriately using the names of the gods, because Plato is describing our souls and how we are to orient our souls toward the good, and it is through the gods, who are orderly, perfect souls that are meant to guide us toward the good. So compare that to... Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's funny, the kind of... I almost want to call it mental gymnastics at some level that happens in trying to describe what's going on in the Timaeus, even by later Platonists, is kind of comical to me, because if you really read the Timaeus directly, you'll be very confused if you've already been sort of introduced to certain Platonic ideas, later Platonic ideas, in people like Iamblichus and Proclus, you're going to be very bamboozled because you're going to get to this point where it talks about the demiurge creating the junior gods. And then all of a sudden, the junior gods are actually identified specifically as being the Olympic gods. And so there's this trend later in Platonism to sort of dismiss that as not being what Plato really meant by it. He wasn't really saying that the Olympic gods are these junior gods. It was those are a different mode of the gods, right? They're the junior god mode of the gods, but the gods are actually up and down the chain everywhere and in all these different ways. This is just like their lowest manifestation or something like that. But that's very much not what Plato is saying himself. I think if you take him at face value, what he's saying, it's you have to ask yourself the question, like, why would he put it that way if that's not what he meant? He could have easily said it another way when you're explaining the origin of the universe, but he didn't. He was very particular about making sure that we understood that gods were these immortal souls.
And he straightforwardly says, I dare not name the demiurge. Like, he's like, I'm not going to tell you his name. I'm not going there. So, which I wanted to ask you about, because typically we understand Jove, Jupiter, Zeus to be the demiurge. Would you say that is more so like the demiurge as we see it according to our chain of gods? Or how would you kind of separate the two? Or what would you say regarding that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very much like what I was talking about before, where Jove is our leader god. So that is the god that we're looking to as the highest divine soul in our particular chain, our particular pantheon. And it's only natural at some level, if we were looking to him as your leader and ultimate example, that when you see what the demiurge is, you see him as like a perfect reflection of the demiurge, right? Because he's participating that demiurgic intellect so perfectly that he is like that to us, right? And so it's not a huge stretch for us to then just say, oh, well, he is that, right? Or that's the name that we use for it. And even, when we look at the names Jupiter and the name Zeus, it's like they're very related to the name God. So it's like there's a very deep connection between those types of things. And so it's not hard for us to project onto it. So I think the important thing for us, though, is to remember that even though we see Jove as being that demiurgic intellect, it doesn't mean that when a Hindu sees Shiva as that demiurgic intellect, we're not wrong necessarily, right? We can both be right about that we've projected the name. Like that is where we bring in these ideas like syncretism from the ancient world, where if we have a universal principle, then the best practice, I would say, is to do what Plato does and don't name it. But if we do, it's at least good to understand that we mean it syncretically.
Yeah, no, that's a good point there. I also wanted to get into this idea that you are really kind of delving into within your articles, which is the idea of personhood. And I think we've seen that this has done a lot of heavy lifting in other traditions. And a lot of criticisms of Platonism are aimed at the one as being this impersonal principle, and how that is, a very bad thing. There's no such thing as an impersonal God. So if you could kind of tease out the differences between, you talk about persona as kind of, a more modern understanding of person, but then also the kind of ancient idea of person, even though they don't necessarily call it person, right? And this gets into a little bit into epistemology. We'll try not to go too far down that rabbit hole. But if you could really talk about these kind of discoveries surrounding person, personhood, and persona, I think that'd be really helpful for understanding the gods.
Sure. Yeah, and I think it's one of the most complex topics that we have. And so, the post I wrote about it was where, I was very careful in constructing how that all works from an ancient perspective versus the modern perspective of personhood. But we can kind of talk about it high level here, a little more loosely. But the first thing I think to understand is that our modern conception of personhood is very psychological and is based around this idea of subjectivity, of being the thing that it experiences particular things, right? We experience this sense of, I experience my memories, I experience my feelings, my this, my that. It's my internal perception of all of those things. And so much so that you could say, people are very fearful of the idea of, say, losing their memories or losing, the things that are familiar to them around them because they define who they are. To try to imagine who you are as a person absent your life experiences, your memories, what we would call kind of your idiosyncrasies, even just your personality itself. It's difficult for us to understand what personhood could possibly mean beyond that, right? So that's the modern conception of personhood. Whereas the ancient conception with Aristotle and Plato was much different. They looked at it much more like asking the question, if we can know things, and for them knowing wasn't knowing our memories or sense data, these things that are ephemeral, but if we can know things that are eternal, the things like the eternal forms, for example, which is our sort of ultimate goal as far as knowledge is concerned, what kind of thing do we have to be in order to be able to do that? What kind of entity are we? And the simple answer to it is that we are knowers. That's what we are. And that's sort of the nature of our personhood, is to know. And what that means, though, isn't that we are this thing that experiences things. We're not the subject necessarily of experience. We're the subject of knowledge. And knowledge is knowledge of the eternal forms. And that's our ultimate personhood. That's the sort of real subjective content, if you can call it that we're seeking, is to become unified with that kind of knowledge. So that's already pretty heady, I think.
Yes, it is.
Because we're talking about these very like personal things to us, and it's kind of hard to wrap our heads around, because I think the idea of idiosyncratic subjectivity is just so embedded in us, the way that we think about who I am and what I am, that, I hear it expressed a lot of times when people ever hear about, even in Eastern religions, about the idea that, the self dissolves into Brahman or something like that. Or even if I were going to explain that, or when we read something like the myth of air and we think about that moment of drinking the oblivion, right, from the river, and we lose all of our memories and we have to go back to another life, like, it's kind of a terrifying thing to us. And I think the terror part of it is that, to us, that's who we are. Like, you might as well just be dead in our estimation. If everything that I think I know about myself as this personality is dissolved, who are we after that? Well, Plato has that answer, that it's like, that's not what you were in the first place. You were you insofar as you know the eternal forms. And that's your true nature. And everything else is ephemeral. Everything else is going to pass away. And so he's always kind of encouraging us to move closer to that, because that really is the sort of eternal life, is to be more aligned with that, rather than be aligned with this personalized identity that we've crafted for ourselves. That's the illusion. That's the persona. That's doxa and appearances. It's not who we really are. And so that can be, it's a challenging notion for sure. But I think we have to get that understanding right before we can start to understand, like, what do we mean by personhood? Because if we understand that to be what personhood is, then this idea that we get from Christianity about personhood is so wrong. To think when we say something like God is personal, what they mean is God is idiosyncratic. God is a personality just the same way that you and I have that kind of personality in the modern sense, right? That he's the subject of experiences and the subject of particular memories and things like that, right? And that's why he ends up being personified so much and given this very person-like character. But really what we mean by that is something completely different, right? What we mean about personhood when we're talking about the demiurge is really the idea that God is like knowledge itself. It contains within all things that are true, all the eternal forms, and is that perfectly. And I think we shouldn't let that tell us that he's not personal at all. Like, in fact, he's the most person, the supreme person in that sense. But our definition of what a person is very skewed by our sort of modern assumptions. And when it comes to the gods are much more persons in the subjective sense, in that kind of modern sense. They're still much more persons that way. And that's also why we relate to them. There's without a doubt, it's easier to understand beings that are closer to us than ones that are somewhat more perfected in their personhood. It can be difficult to grasp them. And so we do work up a ladder to understand that bit by bit. And you can even see that in your own personal life, right? Like you'd probably have an easier time relating to a friend of yours with a similar background. You can understand them a little bit more than trying to understand, the president, for example. Just has a very different life than you. Some guy who's a billionaire and, running the country. You're probably not going to relate to his life nearly as much as somebody who's a little bit closer to you. And works the same way with the gods. We want to work up that ladder of virtue to them by similarity. I hope that answered your question.
Yes.
That was kind of a long thing.
No, it does. One thing I liked is you went into persona and how the kind of etymological roots of that refer to masks, which was kind of portrayed in plays by actors wearing different masks who were different persons. And It really got me thinking about, what Plato's really getting at, to use that same analogy, is that we're not the masks that we're wearing. We are the wearer of the masks. And what that is kind of a lot more difficult to really understand because of this kind of ephemeral nature that we have regarding what persons are. It goes back to the whole cave analogy. We're looking at the shadows and thinking those are the real things, but it's really something that's behind the shadows, and that is, projecting this kind of this lesser image of. So regarding the gods, like the personal gods, the psychic gods, as you would call them, right? Gods of religion. So in a sense, they still are kind of, and correct me if I'm wrong because I'm just kind of spitballing here, but they would almost be wearers of masks, but they would be more divine, more orderly, more stable. They are kind of like God seen through more specific instances. Am I following this correctly? Would you kind of put it in those terms, or what would you say regarding
absolutely.
the gods and the kind of relational aspect there? Because that's another thing you're talking about. And originally I would have understood personhood or personality as meaning relational. Like we can relate to them, we can have a kind of relationship with them where there are those similarities, there is this kind of common ground. So regarding the gods and persons as knowers, would it be that their knowledge is more relational to our level of knowledge than, say, knowledge itself? Is that what you're getting at there?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to explain it. So yeah, to answer your question, they are personal and they do have personas. Like that is what makes them what they are. The way that we can identify them as particular persons, is what makes those psychic gods, and psychic meaning that they're of the soul, not that they're, ESP.
Like
although I guess they do have that too. But they have that relational quality. And I think that's such a good definition. I'll probably use that from now on, that when we usually think of personality in the modern sense, it is that, right? We're thinking relational, that there's me and there's you, and we can have this relation together, right? And what makes this a little bit different for us is that when we're talking about real personhood, the sort of height of that is not relational. And what that means, though, is not that there's no relationship at all. It's that the relationship collapses into identity, meaning we become identified with that. And when we're talking about these ideas about like henosis and theosis, that's exactly what we're talking about. That the height of our experience when it comes to this is the collapse of that relationship. We're no longer relating, it's me and the God that I'm worshiping, right? That collapses into identity where we are the same thing in that moment. And that is our true knowledge, and that is our true personhood, is to be identical with that. And everything else is actually kind of a deficiency from a Platonic standpoint. Relation is a kind of deficiency. Like ultimately, there's that identity at the core of being. And if we are at one with that being, we are the same as it in that moment. But so far as there is relation and that, modern sense of personality, that's really a deficiency. It's calling out that we're separated, right? And we don't have that identity. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but we're working our way back towards identity, not towards just a good relationship.
And that's really funny to think about, because personality in the modern sense, it's really kind of praised for being as different, as distinct, as unique
Right.
as you possibly can be.
Sure.
Whereas what you're presenting is kind of the opposite, whereas true personhood is being unitive. It's being uniform and holistic and having a stable identity, and relating back to these stable identities is how we actually grow our personality, as opposed to, trying to be as different as we possibly can be. Which is kind of interesting, because I believe you even said that psychology is divisive. Like the psychological activities, it implies division. And at the level of like the one, or even at the level of the demiurge, it's beyond division, and it is a unity. And that is what is stable, and that is what is like this kind of it's at like the height of the knower, is to be knowledge itself, in a sense.
Right.
Which I wanted to tie back into this idea of the intelligible gods, since we're already in the heady waters.
We're going there.
Let's just go for it. Because at first,
if you're following so far, I think they're ready for it. If somebody hasn't turned this off by now, they're probably like, all right, I'm ready for that.
Right. And I was hoping we could kind of cover many different bases to where, we can relate to someone who's just getting into this stuff and wondering about the gods, but also kind of appeal to those who are looking at this set of articles with a more critical eye. So let's just try to hit them all. So the intelligible gods. Now, at first, I saw this as being kind of contradictory. It's like, well, what are these all about then? If the whole idea is to recognize the gods as being personal, relational, souls like we are, and then there's this idea of, well, then there's the intelligible gods who are kind of above all that, but they're still gods, and they're coextensive with the forms. Again, we're just going there, so might as well. They're coextensive with the forms,
Right.
Which makes sense to me, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, and I know you kind of drew a lot of this from Plotinus. So relating to the intelligible gods, would you say they are above the psychic gods in the sense that they are more on that level of metaphysics where they're shared and common to all traditions, whereas the psychic gods are more particular to peoples, pantheons, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the basics of it, where, the important distinction here is that if we're following from what we're saying about personhood, right, that the ideal of personhood is in being, and it's not just in this relational level. And being is metaphysical. It's what we call the nous in Platonism. And so if that's sort of the root of where that identity and personhood is really coming from, then Plotinus is right to point this out, that it follows that what is in the nous is our beings, our divine beings. That it's not simply reducible to principles, right? That some people have this vision of the nous that it's like mathematical shapes floating around in like an ether or something like that. It's this realm. And I like to stress too that like if you really dive into what Platonists like Plotinus and others are saying about the nous, even stuff that's in like the Corpus Hermeticum, the nous is like a heaven above heaven, right? Like it's actually very difficult for our minds to grasp what the nous is in its reality. It's very, very difficult. And Plotinus, I think, does a better job than anybody in Aeneid 5:8, where he starts describing that it's like light viewing light, that it's like statues of light that are each of the shown to each other, each within each other, their light shining within each other all at the same time. And it's like
sounds like Henadology a little bit.
Well, it does sound like Henadology. And honestly, I think that that's actually the proper place for us to put things like Henads if you're going to incorporate them into our theology at all. But it's very much works that way. That kind of language that we're used to hearing in this sort of Henadic way is actually exactly how Plotinus is describing what's going on in the nous. And the reason is it's what he calls a one many. So it is one and many simultaneously. And I think for our minds that live in a very divided world where I'm not you, you're not me, I'm not the table, I'm not, the table's not the wall, my house is not my neighbor's house. Like, it's very hard to grasp what one manyness would mean. But he does his best to describe it as essentially like the things are still the things. There's still the many different things, but each thing is fully available to each other and sort of transparent to one another, like light shining into light. And that'll mess with your mind for sure. But that's the best way to kind of visualize it if you're going to visualize it at all. And I hope people, through what I'm saying, understand that like my goal here is not at all to like drag the gods downward into lower strata of the universe. It's actually to elevate some of the things that I think have been downgraded over time. The soul almost never gets talked about in a lot of the later Platonism as being like very significant. It always seems like it's like just this mediation point between the nous and everything else. And when you actually look at what Plato's saying, to him, soul is heaven and hell and all of these different realms and all of these different gods. It's like, that's really what we think about when we think about the afterlife. It's like, that's the realm of the soul, essentially. And the nous is above even that. And what's there are these intelligible gods. They are beings. They're perfect intelligences. They are those sort of statues that Plotinus talks about. But because of that, they can't really be identified with those personas. So in the analogy you were doing, I think that that's useful to use here to say there are those personas, right, that we understand as the gods in the soul. Well, whatever's behind that mask, that's what the intelligible gods are. And it's not the mask, it's not the persona, but it's something more primal, more essential than that. And so that's where some of our religion comes together, really, is that those principles are not taking on those idiosyncratic personalities, but they're sort of the source of what they are. The source of their essence is coming from there. So I think in the article, I used the relationship of like justice, that, we may have a god-like Tyr, for example, in the Norse pantheon, and Jupiter, who both are expressing a sort of divine justice, but they're doing it in a particular mode, in a particular persona. And the intelligible God would just be justice, right? As justice, not without that overlay of a personality on top of it.
Yeah, no, I really like that. And what you're talking about there with Platonists having this kind of lower view of the soul. I mean, I was guilty of that myself because it's all about the intellect, right? It's all about the nous, and that's the whole pursuit. But when you do go back in Plato, especially the dialogues that you point out in your articles, you realize that it's not like the goal is to transcend the soul. The goal is to order the soul according to the intellect and the stabilizing forms of the intellect. And even I remember thinking back to Laws, where Plato actually describes the souls of the gods as being like a rotating circle around a fixed center. And that fixed center is reason. That fixed center is nous, intellect, the forms. And that rotation is their kind of motion surrounding that, and their kind of worship of that, and their love of that, and their intimate connection or familiarity with that. So maybe since we've somewhat satisfied the more intellectual types, we can bring it back to the myth of the Phaedrus. I think if you could just kind of give a rundown of that myth and, how it kind of relates all of this through, I mean, if you haven't read it, I think everyone needs to read that myth, because that has always been my favorite myth from Plato. Has been the myth of the Chariot, and that you find in the Phaedrus. So if you want to briefly go through that, so that we can kind of see these connections and see how it ties back to the tradition, and it's also more digestible, easy to understand for the layperson, I think that'd be great.
Yeah. So in the Phaedrus, we get this myth from Plato about what the nature of the soul is, and really what its journey is throughout its existence, essentially. And it's said that the soul is placed in this chariot, and that we have this sort of chariot that we've got that's going through this procession in the heavens, and we're following the gods, and they are also in chariots. And so let's just start with that analogy right away. There's so much there already. First off, Plato's telling us that there's this similarity between us and the gods. And the difference between us and the gods is one of sort of quality and strength, right? The gods, they ride through the cosmos on these chariots, and they don't falter at all, right? They're always perfect in their motions. They're always doing everything right. They don't falter. They don't go askew. They don't go off course. But we humans are following them as best as we possibly can, but we're making a mess of it, right? We can't control the two horses at all. They're going this way, they're going that way. And eventually, if we go astray enough, we essentially fall. We fall from this realm of the heavens in the soul, and we fall into materiality, essentially, and become sort of encased in more physical form. And those physical forms then define us and who we are. And we go through our lives basically trying to regrow our wings so that we can rejoin with that circuit of the gods. And there's so many things that I think are embedded in this myth that just tell us a lot about who we are. Obviously, there's that part about the relationship of us to the gods, but also what our ultimate goal is. He explains how the gods, they go up to the top of the vault of heaven, which in this case is the vault of the top of the soul, is basically the highest part of the soul. You could say highest realm of the soul. And from there, they look at what is beyond, at what he calls the plane of truth. And the plane of truth is what we call the nous, right? That is the realm of the divine forms, the eternal forms. And from looking at that, from contemplating it, and that's really like the deepest meaning of what the word contemplation means, is to see, to look. They look upon that and they are nourished by it. It nourishes who they are, and it brings them back into alignment with divinity. And really, he says that they never really stray from that. It's one of the things to know. We might think that it means that the gods are kind of like, they become perfect and then they're not perfect, but he explains that, this is part of the analogy, is they are always kind of doing that. They really are always connecting with that plane of truth. But the analogy just, that's what it means, right? They're always going to that. And we can do that too. Like, that's what they're leading us towards, right? So we're in these circuits, we're following the gods, they're going up and looking beyond at the plane of truth and being nourished by that divine illumination. And they're trying to guide us to do the same. They're trying to be a good example to us and lead us and help us do the same. And Plotinus and Plato both point this out, that we can do the same thing, right? We can go and we can gaze upon the plane of truth, and we can stay with it for as long as we can stay with it. You know, our nature is not like the gods. The biggest difference is that we fail. We fail, we falter, we make mistakes. They don't. And so, but we can be like the gods for as long as we can maintain being like the gods, right? But that requires us to be just and pious with wisdom, as Plato says.
I love the image he uses with the mountain, and you know, the souls are trying to control their chariots and steer them so they can climb the mountain and ascend with the gods, where they are doing this kind of, you know, procession or revolution. And I mean, just thinking about that, it's so easy to see where we allow our horses to kind of pull us different directions rather than really being the ones in control. And it's quite obvious just throughout our day-to-day experience. So it really is a powerful image, I think. And this idea of regrowing our wings so that we can, you know, climb from that which is heavy and weighing us down and become light so that we can climb this mountain effortlessly and join the gods and, you know, feast upon the ambrosia, which is this kind of immortal concoction, which is basically that nourishment that you're kind of referring to, because it says after they go and they perceive the plane of truth, they put their horses back in the stable, they feed their horses ambrosia, and then they feast upon ambrosia. And it really does go to show that that is that kind of fulfillment of personhood that you were talking about before. It is becoming as closely as possible identical with knowledge itself, and that is what is stable and eternal. So I think it's just a beautiful image, and I think everyone should read that myth because it's appropriate for basically all people, I would say. It's just really powerful. Now, I wanted to ask you a little bit more. We touched upon it briefly, but this whole kind of series really kicked off with an earlier article you wrote on the Henads and this kind of debate that's going on. Again, we're going right back to it, but
sure.
But I think it's important to bring up.
Yeah.
So this original kind of article was, you were really getting at, you know, what the nature of the gods again, but you knew that you had to at least address the Henad question, because this is a very deep-seated line of reasoning or argumentation, or just a kind of explanation of what the gods are. As people want to go and rely on these metaphysical principles, which are like the heaviest metaphysical principles that are just confounding to any sane brain. So it's really difficult to wrap our minds around. And I see that, like we touched upon, the intelligible gods kind of fulfill this place that you know, the Henad subscribers are really trying to rectify, which is this idea of unity and manyness, like the one and the many, and they're trying to solve that through the Henads. And it seems to me that the difference between the Henads versus the intelligible gods is the intelligible gods aren't really going beyond their means, in a sense. Like they the Henads are really imposed upon like first principles, like the one. It is kind of like the division that happens at the level of the one, but it's somehow also not division. It's somehow undifferentiated while being distinct. There's this kind of confusing language that surrounds it. So would you say that the intelligible gods is a more appropriate destination for this kind of metaphysical impulse of, you know, separating out the one and the many and trying to rectify that?
Yeah. I mean, you know, describing the nous as a one many is perfect, because that is what we're trying to describe. When people talk about things like the manifold of Henads, you know, you can't have a manifold within pure undivision. It just doesn't make any sense. And, you know, the place where that really properly should sit is within the nous. And, you know, there's an interesting one of Proclus's propositions that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. I think it's Prop 165. I forget, but he says that all of the Henads are posterior to limit and unlimited, which would mean that they are in being, right? And I've heard people say too, there's a couple others who think that when he says super essential, he doesn't mean it in the Platonian way. And what he's saying when he says super essential is really that they're above particular essences, but not that they're beyond being, right? So I think that that's one way that we could try to sort of reconcile what's going on in it. But I do think that there's a lot of people who do have this conception that either there's division at the level of the one somehow, is sort of inexplicably, like you had mentioned, or we're positing implicitly some kind of realm in between the one and the nous to try to explain how one relates to the other. But I think Plotinus does a great job of explaining how we get from the one to nous, and doing that without having to involve these participatory Henads and all of that stuff. I don't want to go too far into it, but I think I addressed my grievances with it in that previous post called On Gods and Henads. And to be honest, I've never really heard anybody give me a solid rebuttal to it that I thought was good. Like I'm open to hearing any kind of criticisms of it.
So that's an open invite for those who are listening.
That's an open invite. If somebody, I would talk to somebody about it too. I mean, my gripes with it are pretty straightforward. But there's even other great Proclus scholars like Gerd van Riel, who wrote one of the chapters of All from One, where he kind of mentioned the same thing, that there have been these kind of problems within Proclus forever. It's not like an unknown thing. Like we're kind of falling into these traps, I would say, but they've been well known as kind of being theologically problematic for a long, long time. And that's Van Riel's answer to the question too, is that really these are more associated with being than they are with the one. Like leave the one alone and they're actually in being. But if that's the case, then I would say, yeah, they're basically analogous to these intelligible gods that I'm talking about.
Right.
And we just I don't think we need to conflate or inflate our metaphysics any more than it already is. I think, for the sake of parsimony and just sort of Occam's razor, let's keep it as simple as we can. And I think that's the right path.
Yeah, and I think it fulfills all of those needs too, especially since one thing I never understood, not to get too far into the weeds here, but one thing I never understood is this kind of idea that there is like people are following a line of reasoning to impose or posit this idea of the Henads. And I always thought, well, how are you seeing past the intellect? If you're saying they're super logical or intellectual, hyper intellectual, beyond the intellect, how are you getting there? Like you're not able to see past that. The intellect is kind of like our stopping point. Other than that, it's ineffable. I mean, there's a reason why it's ineffable. It's because it's beyond intellect. The one is ineffable because it is simply beyond intellect. So anyway,
I had mentioned that to somebody at one point, like we were going back and forth about the Henads, and I usually find in those conversations with people, I get to this point where they appeal to what I would call like super essential incomprehensibility, is what I think I called it in my original post, where they say, well, because we're talking about the one and the one's beyond all division, it's unknowable and all of this, then it sounds paradoxical, the Henads, and it sounds like you can't really understand it, or it doesn't really make sense because it's beyond the realm of nous and discursive reason and all of that. And I think it's like, okay, but if that's the answer, then one, how do you know anything about it at all? If it really is truly incomprehensible, because you're making a positive cataphatic statement that these things do exist for sure, without any doubt, and they have to exist. Okay, well, how would you know that if it really is truly ineffable? When we talk about the one, that's part of it, is that it's not really anything. It's not any particular thing. So to ascribe this particularness to it, and then say, well, I can't explain it because it's beyond explanation. It's like, well, how do you know in the first place? And so I just mentioned that, it's like if we get to that point in the argument, I think it's just kind of over. It's just like, okay, like we've just admitted that we're like not in the realm of logical talk anymore. We're just kind of like saying, oh, well, I want this to exist, and I don't really have a good explanation for it, but it's going to be there because I like it. I don't know. Like I don't think we can really have much of a logical conversation past that point.
Right. It's like as soon as incomprehensibility is mentioned, we should just say, great, we agree. Let's leave it there.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I think that's the best way to do it, is be like, great, I agree. It's totally incomprehensible. Let's stop talking about it. Yeah.
Anyway, with that out of the way,
Yeah.
let's move on to something that's definitely more graspable. Is that a word?
Mm-hmm.
Easily grasped. I wanted to talk about the Pantheons. So you mentioned that this kind of solves the issue that we see surrounding this hard polytheism or hard separation distinction and a really kind of too soft of a syncretism or too hard of a syncretism,
Right.
however you want to look at that.
Right.
So what are the implications of what you're talking about here with the psychic gods as perfect orderly souls who are real beings, who are persons? What does that mean for the many pantheons problem? What does that mean? Does Odin exist and Zeus exist? They're not one and the same? They're actually truly separate. How do you see all that?
Yeah. I think exactly that. It gives us the grounding to understand how can these different pantheons exist separately and yet have some sort of common unity, right? We're not saying that reality is split. We're not saying that there's multiple different realities, that the reality for people who follow Norse religion is different than the reality that we live in, right? We're saying that those are ultimately one reality. But they are particular souls. And so we can say, if there's enough reason to believe that they're different and not collapsible into one another, that they really are, that those differences are meaningful and constitutes a different person, a different being, right? And this is, I've gotten some great comments back from people on this who had like interesting objections that I almost wish I incorporated into the original piece. I might write a follow-up on some of the good objections I've gotten, because some people had said things like, well, what about the fact that the etymology of all of these gods goes back to this Proto-Indo-European, unified idea, like Perkonos, I think was one somebody mentioned, which was related to Thor and, these other gods. And, one of the things I had mentioned there was that we really shouldn't think that etymology defines the gods. Etymology explains where we got the names, but the gods are not reducible to names, right? We'd be nominalists, really, if we thought that. And so saying that just explains how we got to the names that we got to. And you could have two gods that come from the same name, or our convention for naming them, it comes from the same place, but that doesn't actually mean that the god itself is the same god, right? They could still be a separate god. And vice versa, right? You could have two gods that come from completely different etymological roots, and then actually find out that, those are actually the same gods. It's two names for the same god. And an example like that might be something like Hermes and Mercury, right? It's like, I would recognize those as essentially being the same god, or at least I couldn't tell the difference between them, right? And say why one is completely different than the other. Whereas when we look at a god like Odin, is Odin really Mercury? I mean, this has kind of been this question in paganism for a long time. I've heard a lot of it over the last 10 years. And my simple answer is no, they're not the same God. And I come at that partially from experience, but I also come at it from this understanding of the gods. Like, if we understand them as souls, there's no problem in saying that they are just different, right? And they're participating maybe similar things. They participate in these sort of intelligible realities that are very similar. One's related to communication, maybe wealth or magic and things like that, but that doesn't mean that they're identical. And so that is ultimately what we're looking at, is that these pantheons are different, but they are different chains or series of souls that are leading souls in different ways. They all realize that souls are different. and groups of souls are different, and they need to be led in different ways. And so about how we attain back to God is ultimately going through the series of gods that leads us in particular ways. And there's one that's natural for our souls, that's best for our souls, that's defined by the gods. But part of our job is discovering what that is and aligning back to it.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. It's almost like those similarities are that true identity, which is the kind of intelligible content that the gods are converging upon, that those souls are kind of, pointing us toward. So I thought that the idea of the intelligible gods really actually strengthens that case, that the gods as souls are different. And it allows a lot more room for these pantheons to actually be real and in a sense independent of other pantheons. So I think that's great. Now I wanted to ask you too, with the pantheon problem, there's also this idea that I've heard regarding daimons. And, daimons, it's kind of a big question of, where daimons tie into all of this. Like the daimons, they're souls too, right? And I assume daimons of the gods are more orderly than our souls. I mean, that's what we see throughout all the literature. Even Hesiod talks about how, the souls of the golden age really came back as daimons in a sense. Like those are the daimons. They were actually real humans in a sense. They were souls on this earth. So how do we fit in the daimons there and understanding this? And are there pantheons where they're more like daimonic, not demonic for those out there who are
Like
coming from a
daimonic.
certain background? Yeah. But are they more on the level of kind of like spirits closer to us, or is that kind of equal across the boards for all pantheons? How do you see daimons playing into this, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a great question because even amongst the ancient world, the sort of definition of a daimon changed and altered a lot over time. And so, you can even see situations where people call the gods as daimons, because really daimon just meant spirit. And so it's kind of like a very broad term that later under Iamblichus, it gets like very specifically classified as this more lower level entity that's a spirit that's tied to the material world more directly. And so, I generally take his interpretation on that. I think as far as we're going to classify the difference between a daimon and an angel and a god and all of that, that a daimon is essentially the spirits that are closest to materiality, that aren't humans, right? Like we're in it, but they're above us, but very heavily pressing in on the material world, you could say. And so I think a lot of like daimons, like in myth, how we talk about the naiads and the dryads and, these sort of elemental spirits of the forest, things like that. You see gnomes and fairies and stuff like that. Like I see those as being very daimonic type entities.
More closely, the way I've understood it, and it makes sense to me still, in light of this distinction between theology and metaphysics, is that daimons are almost like the soul behind the kind of more direct material mechanisms. I don't really want to put them in a mechanistic way, but in a sense, it isn't, because I see souls being primary, and the mechanism is kind of what follows from that. So that's the way I've understood like nature spirits, like dyads, dryads, even like gnomes. They're these kind of earth spirits, elementals. Would you say that's an appropriate way of looking at them, and they are more so like in the chain of a god, just kind of more closer to our level? Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a good way to put it. And things always fan out in the hierarchy for us. And so I think it's important to remember, like when we're talking about chains of gods, I think, and maybe this is coming from like the more Henatic way of looking at it, that like everything is ordered to these particular and discrete chains where it's very, very like clean lines between them. But I don't think in reality it actually plays out that way, where what we actually see is that there's more unified things the higher you go up, But the further you go down, it's the more multiplied they become and the more they participate in multiple things at the same time, right? So like even take humans. Like, I mean, when we do astrology, what are we doing? It's like we're looking at how some of these forces, some of them godly, are affecting us. And you're not just affected by one. Go look at your charts and stuff like that. And it's like you actually have like multiple different influences all coming at you all at once, right? And that's because of our divided nature. Because of that division and multiplicity, we end up participating things in a somewhat more multiplied way. So it's not perfect, right? You don't get, boom, perfect. I'm perfectly in this chain and only in this chain.
Right.
It's like, now you're probably kind of a part of a couple chains all at once. And you're trying to get back to it. And as you go up, purify and order your soul, it'll become more simplified. It'll become less chaotic as you put yourself back together, essentially.
Okay, that's interesting. And I would agree with that. I do definitely see it more as this kind of gradient that we've talked about in the past.
Right.
Where there's not these really hard, clean separating lines. Now, that does still bring up the question for me of, evil spirits. Like evil spirits, are these daimons? Because I think a lot of the time people think of daimons or spirits. It's probably better to just say spirits because it's more broad, and I think it can kind of fulfill a lot more of these different roles.
Sure.
But
I mean, that's what they meant by the word too. So,
yeah.
I mean, you see that kind of loose use of the word daimon in the ancient world because to them they were just spirits,
right. But I used to think of it as like, okay, human souls, daimons, purified souls, like it's this very
Right.
clean ladder that is, climbing up to the one,
Sure.
eventually terminating at, transcendent God.
Right.
But I think you're right with spirits. It kind of leaves more room, more play, more wiggle room because there aren't these very hard separating lines. There's a kind of, there's a lot of nuances at work here. When
Right.
we're talking about souls, because we're not talking about mechanisms. We're not talking about strict kind of mathematics. It's a lot
Right.
more abstract in a sense, as is the nature of anything dealing with, mental activities. So what about evil spirits then? Are they kind of on the same level as us? Is there such a thing as like evil spirits that are in a sense like higher on a chain than us? And how does that work?
Yeah.
This is an area that's still a little gray and foggy to me, I think, in the tradition. So what are your thoughts on that in general?
Yeah, that's such a good question, such an interesting question. So I usually hear this kind of phrased as if we're thinking in those strict levels, right? Like we take Iamblichus, for example, and say, okay, it's us, then there's purified souls, then there's daimons. Then if there's an evil daimon, is that an evil daimon that's also like 2 levels higher than us in sort of spiritual rank or whatever?
Right.
And yeah, I mean, I can understand that's kind of confusing. You look at it and go like, yeah, that doesn't really make sense. So I think there's a couple different things going on. For one, I think there's daimons that might be perceived by us as being evil, but they aren't sort of ontologically evil. So take the Furies, for example. If you have the Furies who are responsible for sort of divine punishment and punishing transgressions, you've seen people in your life who just seem like they're cursed, right? Like I think we've all seen people like that for one reason or another. And you're like, I don't know if it's a past life or this life or something. I don't know. That person is cursed. Like there's whatever's happening to them is not good. And, it could be something like that like they do have something acting on them there's a bigger plan to it that we don't necessarily always see. And so it can look like that to us in the moment, but it's playing out the way that it needs to play out. So it could just be a misunderstanding on our part that if it is really a genuine daimon and it's going that way. But, the way that Iamblichus describes it, and I think the way he does is pretty good, is that some of the daimons can be manipulated. And they are like, I hesitate to use the word mechanical too, like you were saying, but they're, we have these ones that are more irrational. meaning like they're a soul within the universe that is operating, that does have a particular function, but they can be influenced. They can be changed or distorted in some ways, and typically by humans. And so it is sort of a manipulation by humans that can create these sort of energies that go awry. I also think that human souls too can just get lost and become shades, essentially, you know, that if a soul that is too attached to that personality that we were talking about, imagine a soul that doesn't want to let that go, that's very attached to its particular incarnated form, can definitely become a sort of ghost on this world. You know, we see that in even myths like the Aeneid. You know, we see what happens to these souls in the Asphodel Meadows that basically have either, you know, lived kind of not so great lives or committed suicide or whatnot, and they become these kind of like hungry shades, right? That could potentially negatively influence us. I tend to lean towards more of personal experience. Like, I know you've had some experiences in your life that were, you know, of, let's say, scary spirits. Let's put it that way. I think we all have maybe experienced something like that in our lives. I think if you're doing spiritual practice a lot, you'll become aware that, like, okay, not everything's benevolent out there, right? There are some things that are truly seem malicious. It's the only way you can really describe it. So I do think that there's a place for that. And I think what it is, it's probably a variety of things, you know, like I said, it's either functional and needs to be there for one reason or another, like the Furies, and we may see it as being bad, or maybe manipulated human souls as well that have become sort of shades that influence the world in negative ways.
Yeah, no, I think that is definitely a very kind of astute observation, is that it's not really this black and white, like, oh, this is what they are, here's the rank they're at. There's definitely a lot of nuance involved, and it's a lot more complex, especially at this level that we're at with, you know, soul. Things are more kind of, in a sense, like, what's the word I'm looking for? Not distilled, but they're like the prism, you know, the light passing through the prism. There's definitely a lot more of that going on, where there's a lot of difference. There's a manyness there. So with these different types of spirits, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to add, like, I think this might answer your question, is that evil is chaotic and disordered by its nature. And sometimes I think when we're trying to understand evil, we're trying to ask almost an impossible question when we go, what's the order of evil? How is evil ordered and structured? Right? As though like there's a hierarchy of evil, and there is no hierarchy of evil. That's what makes it evil. It's disordered and chaotic by nature. And so like when you look at it, it's like, it's not like there's an army of demons who are all, you know, going towards the same goal. What actually makes them demonic is that they refuse to participate in the divine order, and they're more selfish than anything. And so like they can't be organized into the whole properly because they're refusing organization altogether, right? And so when we're talking about something like a shade, it's like a shade that has gone malicious is one that's like refusing to go along with the divine order and going, no, I want to stay me and keep pursuing the things that I want to pursue by myself. I don't want to go get reincarnated and drink from the river Lethe and forget who I was. I like who I am. I'm staying like this, right? And it's like that confusion and disorder will turn into a kind of evil in the world, right? And that's more what it is. I think it's not something that we can look for a ton of order and structure in. And if there is any order and structure in it, then it's because it's one of these things that looks evil but really isn't evil, right?
Right. Yeah, diffusive was the word I was looking for there.
Yeah.
But yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially because I think what you're referring to there with these kind of spirits that appear to us as being terrifying, genuinely terrifying, a lot of the time it's due to our own kind of inversion of whatever that is and that relationship we have with it. We're something's misaligned there, something's disordered. And if we were to put it in the proper order, then we would see the necessity, the divine necessity of these things.
Right.
So yeah, a lot of the time it's like our error allows us to perceive good things as evil at times.
Right.
But then there are also, genuine souls that are malicious. But the one thing that they all have in common is they are easily overcome with good, truth, beauty, and order. So long as you are living an orderly life, it's like you got nothing to worry about with those things.
Yeah.
They're just ephemeral and temporary and just wisps, and they just kind of flee.
Yeah, they're much weaker than people tend to think.
Yes.
You know, I part of this, I think, as Christians, they really ham it up, but it's like, reality is like, those genuinely malicious spirits, a lot of them don't have very much power at all.
Yeah, you have to give the power to them. And I think really what allows them to get their foot in the door is fear. I think fear
100%.
is 100% what they're feeding off of. It is, and that's literally you saying, "Oh no, you have power over me. Like I'm afraid because you can control me." And they're like, "Okay, if you say so."
Right. Yeah. Well, it's that they feed on that, right? Mm-hmm. They're feeding on that, and that they're getting some power from it. And so, if you give it to them, you give into that. That's why those people who are genuinely not afraid of them and can stay in the light and in with goodness with it, they have little to no power over them, you know? So, and I was going to say also, as far as Platonism goes, hell exists, and there are punishing spirits out there whose job it is to punish people for doing bad things. And it's a core part of Platonism. And so, it's not that there aren't bad things out there, people who have these near-death experiences and get transported to a hellish realm. It's like, well, those are real. Like there are hellish realms that people go to, and that's all part of the process. They're not there forever, but the people who spend a long time there for sure.
Mm-hmm. And not to digress too much, but I was actually having a conversation with an acquaintance the other day, and he comes from a more Christian background, and we're talking about eternal damnation. And he was kind of criticizing reincarnation a little bit and saying, well, if a soul is eternally choosing bad things and inviting kind of this these bad fates upon themselves, which result in kind of hellish realms, what's the symmetry breaker there between eternal damnation and this kind of perpetual state of hellish realms brought about through our own mistakes and choices and decisions? And the one thing I thought was, well, that assumes that there is a possibility of eternally being trapped in evil. And I just don't really see that. That would imply that evil is in a sense stronger than the good. And to me, I'm like, well, at some point, like if you extend that into infinity, the good wins out every single time. Like that person is going to come around through divine providence and through the very fact that those lessons that they're faced with are opportunities for growth and for, reaching back to the divine while it's, while its hand is being extended out to you. All you have to do is really grasp it and follow that. And so anyway, like I said, I don't want to digress too much. But I wanted to move on to morality here, because this was, the second to last installment in this series of articles, I believe. Is that right? Mm-hmm. It was the second to last one?
Yeah, I think it was the second to last, yeah.
Okay, so this is very, very interesting, because this has, again, been one of those things where it's highly... there's a lot of debate surrounding it. Let's say that.
There's a lot. Yeah.
And it seems like you were just kind of going all out with this series of articles, because many such cases there were of that nature, just highly contestable. So with morality, now we see a lot of people are arguing for this kind of divine command theory of morality, which you make a case that it can kind of work in Christianity because they do collapse metaphysics and theology. So for them, God is the good. But for pagans, for people who are polytheists, who worship the gods, heathens, Hellenists, whatever you are, it doesn't really work because of our view of metaphysics and theology. So if you could lay that out, how you kind of got to this point of seeing these differences between divine command theory and what you'd call moral realism, and the issues that surround that. If you could just kind of jump in wherever and take off with it.
I mean, I think the best place to start is with Plato. We have one of the greatest dialogues on this philosophical question in the Euthyphro. And you can look up the Euthyphro dilemma. It's a classical philosophical dilemma about God and morality. And in it, it's such an interesting dialogue. It's maybe one of my favorites. It's short, but it's really fun. So Socrates is on his way to court where he's going to give his apology. That's in Plato's Apology. And he comes across Euthyphro, this younger guy, in the marketplace on his way to court, and strikes up a conversation with him. And Euthyphro's there near the courts because he's accused his father of murder, essentially. His father caught one of these slaves of his doing something he wasn't supposed to do. I think he actually murdered somebody else. And so he tied him up, he left him in a ditch, and then he called for the authorities to come and get him. And his dad kind of forgot about him. And then the guy died in the ditch, unfortunately.
As you do when you tie one up in a ditch. You often forget they're there.
Yeah. Classical Greece problems, I guess. So that happens. And so Euthyphro's there out of this sense of morality, where he goes, my dad did something wrong. He wronged this guy. And yeah, he may have been a criminal, and, he probably would have been executed anyways, but it doesn't matter because he that guy, essentially, and he needs to pay the price for it. And Plato's not so sure, or Socrates in this case is not so sure about it. He's kind of wondering, where are you getting this sense of piety and impiety that, your father's done something wrong? Like, where do we get that from? And Euthyphro makes this case that it comes from the gods, and he starts quoting these myths and explaining how in the myths, like, this is what the gods are saying we have to do, that we have to uphold justice no matter what, and all of this. And Plato, or Socrates, is questioning him about it. And they get to this dilemma, essentially, where they're asking a question, is that, are the gods good by themselves? Or let's phrase it this way. Are the commands of the gods good because they're commanded by the gods? Is that what makes a command good? Is just simply that it came from the gods? Or are commands from the gods good because the gods are referencing some higher universal good? And that's why they're good, And so essentially it's questioning this idea about divine authority and where it comes from. Is divine authority simply the gods say so, and that's the end of the discussion? And if the gods told you to jump off a bridge and a baby, then that is, ultimately that is the good. Or is there this other good that's above it that they draw from? And the reason why they make good commands is because they understand what the good is ultimately. Okay, so that's where we get with this question of divine command theory, and it's a direct sort of challenge, you could say, to the idea that, hey, if God says so, that's the end of the discussion, right? It's challenging that kind of notion that we have to just take those commands as is, and that there is no good. And the problem ends up being that if we accept that commands from the gods are just good by virtue of being what they are, then that means that morality is arbitrary. It means that morality could be whatever they say. And if they say something good or bad, well, that's kind of a nonsense statement, right? To even think about it that way. It's just whatever they say is good. And I guess the challenge there is we're really falling into relativism then and saying that goodness doesn't even really exist, right? We're collapsing goodness into command. And that's really what I think Socrates is pressing on, is saying that, like, a command itself can't be good, right? Just by virtue of being a command. It has to participate in good. It has to understand what that good is. And the good has to be something higher than that. He doesn't answer that in the dilemma, but that's really that's what he's hitting at. It ends in this aporia where you don't really get an answer. It's actually really funny because he's about to walk into court, and then Euthyphro just kind of gets frustrated with all the questions and goes, I don't have time for this, Socrates. I got to go. And he's like, well, I guess I'm going to go into this court case without knowing what piety is. What a shame. And, it's
also
bit of Platonic humor.
Shortest Platonic dialogue and really readable. And it is really entertaining. Like the way that Plato wrote it was just gold.
Yeah, it's it's almost like a comedy,
Yeah.
just because it's
And it's
what he's drawing out.
it's funny because people often think of Platonic dialogues as being very dry, very academic, and a lot of time you run into those instances where it
Sure.
is very cut and dry.
Parmenides is a real dialogue.
Holy smokes! Yep, it really is.
Yeah.
But stuff like the Euthyphro, or even like I'm a big fan, like Gorgias, I think is pretty
Sure.
funny.
Yeah.
You could tell that he definitely wanted to originally be a playwright, and it's entertaining. But anyway, yeah, what you're getting at there, I think, is very important, because there's also this problem where if it is divine commands, well, then you have to qualify what is a command, and how do we know what these commands are? What is a command? What isn't? And then you get into the problem of, well, they're mediated through individual human beings who existed at a point in history. And you say, okay, well, this guy said that God told him this. And you go, okay, well, how do you know God told him this? Well, because the way he lived his life. So it's like, so anyone who lives their life that way automatically is, getting direct commands from God. It becomes very confusing. The waters get very muddied. And it seems like that's a very poorly thought out plan on God's part, if that is how he kind of mediates, what is
Sure.
good to individuals. He hand selects specific people, and you just have to take their word for it. So what would you say? Of course, you mentioned it ends in aporia, which is just the really character of Plato and Socrates in these dialogues. But what would you say is the better argument? What we call moral realism is that the good in and of itself is what qualifies what is good, what are moral, correct moral decisions, and what have you. So how is it that we discover those then, if they're not commands? How do we discover the nature of morality, and how we can allow that to guide our own lives? If not through trusted, individual people? What would you say to someone who's trying to understand how to work out a moral system?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think on the lower level, there is a benefit to things like divine commands in some level, right? I think they are formative. And, different religions have these different rules, and they do help us sort of outline the good a little bit. When a religion says something like "don't murder," and virtually all religions do, they're outlining something of the good, right? But we can even find some exceptions within that. It's something as simple as like don't murder, but we obviously don't mean self-defense. We don't mean wars. We don't mean it absolutely in that sense. And that's because what we're getting at is like the truth, the good, is something that we actually have to sort of arise to through philosophy, through dialectic, to try to grasp at it directly. But it's not something that is ever propositional. And that's what's, I think, so difficult for us sometimes, is that the good is not a set of propositions. It's not a set of rules and dictums and things like that. But it's the source by which those dictums make any sense at all, right? It's what makes them make sense. You could say it's like the sort of the true north of our moral compass is the good, right? And if you've got that moral compass, it's like you can look at it and go, okay, that is the right direction. It's not going to tell you, it's not a map. It's not going to tell you where to go. It's not going to say, hey, turn right up here and then go left and go do this, right? That's more like the divine commands. Like they can give you those more particular directions of particular situations, but the good is more of that proper direction and the thing that orients and makes something good rather than bad. Like if somebody came up with a divine command that said, murder anybody you don't like, we would know that that was false. We would know right away that, like, no, that's not a real divine command, right? We would immediately know it. And you don't even have to be a philosopher to know that. You just know that that's not right. Or if there was a divine command that came out that said, hurting children is good, hurt children as much as you possibly can, we would know that that was wrong, right? And you don't need to be told that or anything. You have a bit of that moral compass in you that can go, no, that's not right. But obviously there are situations that are much more gray where this is where we get into moral disagreements, right? People are trying to understand, and it's harder to understand where that truth lies. But where the good ultimately comes from, the good is analogous to the one. for us. And so when we're talking about the good, which is ultimately God, and really the argument for the existence of the good is the same as the argument for God and the argument for the one, that there has to be this unity at the core of all things. And that unity tells us a little bit about the character of the good. And it's what we call integrative unity. So what that means is not unity in the sense of everything is the same. That's not what we mean. We mean there's this integrative unity, that things are integral to one another. It's like a harmony, that there's a natural harmony to the cosmos, essentially, where things are in their right place. And what that means in effect is that something that is truly good does not take away from the good of somebody else, right? Now, this requires philosophy for us to really parse out the details about this, to understand the complexities of all the different many situations that there are. But it at least gives us the standard by which we can understand why something is good and why something is not good, right? And so it's a little bit of that compass. But the details working it out are a bit more particular.
Right. So you would say that because not everyone is going to be a philosopher in their lifetime, and perfectly discover what is good and moral and live by it perfectly, there is a need for a kind of mediation. And you go into this, you spend a fair amount of time on this in the article, which is law, and really getting into what law is, the different types of law, how we come to have law, attain law, and then once we discover the true source of it, it's not like you're meant to just throw the law out. You actually have a deeper understanding of it. So how do you see laws working together with this understanding of mediation of the good, what is good? And if you could maybe touch on the different types of laws, like a human law versus a divine law.
Sure.
If you go into that, I think that'd be great.
Yeah, I mainly focus on human law and divine law. There's also natural law is another one that's in the mix there, but didn't really talk about it too much. But every one of those types of laws are ways that we're trying to understand the good and sort of solidify it for particular situations. Because when I'm talking about the good and integrative unity and understanding the source of goodness itself, it's like we're talking about understanding God at some level. And it's not easy to just apply that to daily life. It requires actually some thought and application to really understand how it all makes sense. And so divine laws are very much these sort of time-tested axioms that we have that help align us in that proper direction, right? Where we go, okay, we know that these are the right things to do and they are going to lead us towards the good. These are the sort of non-negotiables that we've found that if we follow along these things, we're always going to be kind of heading in the right direction. And you don't have to be a philosopher to understand them. You don't have to go through that process of figuring out why they're true. They are, at some sense, to just be accepted by most people and taken as like, okay, that's a moral axiom that I can live my life by. And they're very useful for that. If we're trying to teach a child about right and wrong, it's not very helpful to get them into Platonic dialectic and start, working through all of that. It's like, and even for many adults, it's not necessarily the right way to go about it. Sometimes people just need to be told, hey, this is what's wrong. This is wrong and this is right. And divine laws help guide us in that way. And, going with our theory with the gods, that there are these particular chains, it explains why they're different. Different souls need different rules. To think that we all are going to be governed by the exact same rules is nonsensical. I mean, even when we look at human laws are different. The laws in China are different than the laws in the United States. And some of those laws are different because of the people themselves, because they need to be different, right? Because the people are different. And it's not that justice is different in China than it is in the United States, but the way that group of people orders themselves toward the good is going to be somewhat different because they're different. And that's the same with the divine laws. The way that we attain toward the good is going to be slightly different. Some people are going to need a much harsher approach, and going to need to be, kept in line with a harsher set of divine laws. And other groups are going to be able to handle a little bit more flexibility, and it's actually going to be good for the flourishing of their soul because of just the way they are by their nature.
Yeah, and it's almost like with people or like children, I think is a great example. It's not like you punish all children in the exact same way. Like, you very much have to understand their character, what works for them, where they're at with things. Some are going to be more sensitive than others, so you can't have the same kind of tough love style approach. You have to, in a sense, tailor that to what you think is best for that individual. And it seems like this applies on a larger scale to peoples, because there are types of peoples. There are nations and ethnicities and communities, etc. And to me, when I first kind of started to think about justice in this way, when I was getting into Platonism, I thought, well, that seems relativistic. But really, it's that. Sorry, I got distracted. There is a deer like 12 inches away from my window staring at me. Yeah, anyway, I just saw its ears poke up, and that's pretty neat. Anyway, it's more so that it's dynamic. Like, justice is dynamic. Truth is dynamic. It's not this fixed particular thing. Like you said, it's kind of a more overarching, I don't want to say principle, because that kind of makes it devoid of soul and goodness, but it is something that is more unitive at the end of the day, and it's not a particular instantiation. So with that being said, law, would you say, I believe you put it this way, it's an image of the good that is meant to lead us back. So it's not the good itself, but it's almost like a reflection of the good, and it seems to be tailored for individual cases.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it, is that it's an image of good rather than the good itself. And the good itself is always going to be something that's somewhat more intangible than a simple law, right? A law is it's a proposition, it's a command, it's written in language, it has to be written by humans. Even if it was given to us by a god, as in many cases they are, that it still has to go through us, right? It still has to get filtered through us. We have to understand it correctly. We have to write it down correctly. Then we have to transmit it to others correctly. And then we have to copy it directly forever. It's like, there's a lot of places where that can go wrong. And that also doesn't exclude the possibility that some are just simply not divine commands at all, right? That some religions are purely the work of men, right? And, the way that we figure that out, though, there's no way to figure that out if we're not able to grasp the good directly by ourselves, right? If that's not possible, and if we don't have a possibility for knowledge, true knowledge, then we just kind of have to take their word for it. And you'll notice some of the worst divine laws out there are in religions where they don't have that principle of guiding themselves by the good, right? Where it's baked into the religion is this idea that you can't know the good, that you just have to get it from the book or whatever. You can't figure it out yourself. It's like, those are where the worst laws are.
Yeah. And who are you to question it at all? Yeah.
Right. If you can't question it at all. And, I understand people's hesitancy maybe with it sometimes, where they think it's like, are we then defining the good by us?
Right.
They think but hidden in that assumption is the idea, again, that we can't know things, that we can't know the good. It's that any good that we discover is subjective and personal.
Yes.
And it's like, no, what we're saying as Platonists is that, no, there is an objective good, and you can know the objective good. Right. It's not coming from within. That's what we're saying. It's like, when you really discover how to get there, it's not something that is just fabricated within you. That's actually a better description of some things that pass for divine law, is they are more subjective. But we're saying, no, there's an objective path. You can know the truth itself. And so you have a check against these things.
Right. Yeah. And that's a really good point about that being hidden in there, because I often see the same thing, where it's almost like people act as though we invented intellect, like we invented reason. They go, oh, that's just human reason. Why are you trusting human reason? And I just think, I didn't invent reason. Like, these are discoverable. They're not just arbitrary. Like, we just created ourselves somehow.
Right.
It
Like
is
we didn't invent the idea of non-contradiction.
right.
That
The
A
law of
is
identity. Yeah.
A cannot be not A, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
the things like that. It's like we didn't invent that.
Yeah.
No human invented it. They're literally discoveries. We discovered that that is a fundamental law of the universe, a logical law that cannot be broken. It's a part of reality itself. And so that's a discovery. And that's why we treat it as divine, because whether humans exist or they don't exist, it has nothing to do with us. And yet it's always true. And like that to us is pointing towards this idea that like there are eternal laws. There are things that are eternal and forever that are out there that we didn't create. So where did those come from, right? And we treat those as being divine. But that makes rationality divine, right? And our discovery of those things divine as well.
Right. So it's not like someone who has a true knowledge of the good, maybe this very enlightened sage. It's not like they contradict law. They just, you would say they have a deeper understanding of it. And if you were to look at them, you'd say, wow, they are perfectly abiding by law. But at the same time, they are able to almost have more liberty in a sense, more kind of agency, because they have a deeper understanding of that they can navigate waters that, someone who only has a strict kind of law-based understanding of the good may not be able to.
Yeah,
would you say that's because I've seen in traditions people say like I think in Eastern traditions they often say that they kind of go beyond. They go beyond the law in a sense. Like there's a point where they're beyond good and evil. So what would you say about that regarding philosophers?
Yeah, I do think that that's true, but I also think the way that you used sort of liberty there, it's important to distinguish that what we mean is not the contemporary idea of liberty that, in this libertine sense of like, oh, I can just do whatever I want.
Right.
Right. The laws don't apply to me. It's not that. It's liberty in the classical understanding. This is coming from Aristotle, is the ability to govern yourself. And that's the difference. A law, it imposes an external restriction upon you and says, from without, I'm telling you, you cannot do this, or there will be consequences. And true liberty is to be governed from within and to not do those things, not because of something outside of you, but because internally you know not to do them, right? You know the truth about the good and you know that you wouldn't ever do them. But that means also that you may have a different understanding of what is good. When a particular application of the law is being used improperly, you'll actually align to the good before you align to a law that's applied arbitrarily or incorrectly, because you actually get it. You get what the sort of spirit of the law is supposed to be getting at, rather than just being litigious and legalistic.
Letter of the law.
We're going to bring up Christianity here, but like that's what Jesus does when he's like flipping the tables and the money changers and stuff like that. Like that's part of that, is the difference between understanding the spirit of the law versus understanding just the letter of the law. And that's a bit of the difference that we're talking about here. Like someone who understands it may do something that, oh, that goes against what the rule is. And it's like, yeah, but what's the spirit of the rule? It's not always the letter of the law. And that's just the nature of laws. Like they're particular. And so they can always be easily misunderstood, or you can become like a lawyer about it and find a loophole, for example. And it's like, if you're finding a loophole, you kind of missed the point of the law in the first place, right?
Yeah, no, also, I'm glad you said that about liberty, because that's definitely how we often take it today, is liberty is just following the kind of flippancy of your will. Wherever it leads me, I'll just do what I want. And I often think of it as being a sovereign. And a sovereign is someone who is truly stable and truly has identity and is strong in that identity. And the ultimate sovereign is God. So it's becoming as much like God as possible. So it's actually the kind of opposite of what people think today in terms of liberty. And then, just to bring it up, because when I read this part of the article here, it instantly brought to mind Dionysus and him being the liberated God, the God of liberation. And it's not like, he's often described as going beyond social norms in a sense, but it's not like he's spitting on them. It's more so that he
Right.
is the direct kind of understanding of what those are sourced within, that initial kind of divine understanding and where those laws come from. So he is liberated in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah. It's there was a thing Gnostic Informant had a thing this like last week or two where they were talking about like Dionysus is the god of liberalism or something, and I almost went off on it. I thought better, but that just gets right to the point that you're saying. Is that like if we take this wrong understanding of what liberalism and liberty means in the classical sense, then it's easy to see how that goes wrong. Where it's like it's not do whatever you want. It's
because you're a slave
like
to your
you're saying.
passions in that
Right.
under that definition.
Yeah, 100%. Like that's not being a sovereign unto yourself at all. That's not being free. That's being ruled by your lower parts.
Yeah, interesting. Well, cool. Now you had one final article that came out, and I just read it. I don't think it's
I haven't
actually
even put that out yet.
Yeah, I was
but
gonna say I
it'll
don't
come
think
out
it's out yet
shortly.
But
yeah. By the time this is out, it'll probably be out.
Right. So you kind of just summarized everything and reached a conclusion, and I thought you put it very, very. It was beautiful. Honestly, I thought it was great how you just kind of tied a bow on it all. So, in conclusion, what would you say about everything we've been discussing here, the importance of it, and what we can draw from it?
Yeah. What I think this is all circling around, and part of the reason I wrote all of this is trying to restore a sense of Platonic religiosity, that I think it's important for us to have a solid framework for how we build our religious communities, and that Platonism is ultimately a religion, and how we go about forming ourselves and what we do. Answering some of these core questions is essential to that. We have to answer some questions about who are the gods, right? I think that's the most primary question that we have to answer. And even Plato says this, right? That we have to get our conception about the gods correct, or else we're not going to be able to live a good life. That's the first thing he says, is essential. And the things that he points out that we really have to be clear about are really three things. And if we get them wrong, he says these are the sources of impiety. And so those three things we have to get correct are that the gods are real, that the gods care about us, and they care about our well-being. And lastly, that the gods are good, that they cannot be coerced into doing things that are evil or what's the word I'm looking for? Accepting evil, So we have to get those things right. If we get them, what was that?
I just said tolerant, maybe like tolerant.
Tolerant, that's what that's the word I'm looking for. And if we get it wrong, that's impiety, right? If we don't believe that the gods are real, we're atheists, right? If we don't believe that the gods care about us, then that means that we don't believe it matters if we succeed or fail as souls, right? It doesn't matter if we're evil. It doesn't matter if we fall into vice, because they don't really care, right? They don't care if we're good, but they don't care if we're bad either, right? They're careless. And, this is what Plato says, is that to attribute carelessness to them is to make them lower than humans. Humans care. A commander cares for his army. A father cares for his family. You don't think the gods care for us? If they don't have that, then that's making them lower, right? That's a deficiency that they have. That means they're careless. And he says that that's impiety. And I can see directly how that leads to impiety. And that's part of what I talk about in that last post, is that if we really do believe that, then I see directly how that leads to impiety, because I've had it in my own life. Like earlier in my sort of journey with Platonism, like that was one of the things I thought, oh, they're above all that. They're not watching over my life. They don't care if I do these bad things, or if I'm not being perfectly virtuous all the time.
Why do you care? The gods don't even care.
Right. Why do you care? Don't tell me what to do. So that's the core thing, is like, in order to have a proper religious community, we have to get these things about piety straight. Because why even be religious if the gods don't care, right? I center a lot of the article around that, because I think we can all agree that atheism, yeah, of course, we shouldn't be atheists. And of course, the gods are good. But this thing about caring is actually something that I think we've forgotten about I think people have forgotten about this bit of Plato, that Plato is very, very particular about this in Laws, talking about that you have to believe that the gods care for us, and they do care for us, or else we're going to lead ourselves towards impiety. That's really the key thing that I focus in on there, and why. And then beyond that, talking about what we have available to us. And it's really meant to be encouraging. Like, we should be very encouraged by how much material we have, how many books we have, how much we have to build a tradition off of. I think most people, other pagan groups, would be jealous beyond belief that we have what we have. I mean, Plato alone is a gold mine to go off of. And his most famous student, Aristotle, also has humongous amounts of works that we can use to guide, to build communities. His politics are fantastic. Plato's laws are fantastic, his bylaws for how to form a community. And in there, and the other dialogues as well, he tells us what religion means and why religion is important, why we need to engage in religion as the primary way to moral formation and the formation of our souls toward ascent. That's the most essential thing to him, right? And of course, Plato and Socrates think that philosophy is important, but they also recognize that philosophy is not for everybody. But they do say religion is for everybody, and everybody has to be religious.
Yeah. Well, I don't have anything else to add to that. So I think that's enough said right there. And it does give me hope. I will say that. And I think you really did a good job of showing that it is all in Plato, honestly. Like, we don't even, like, everything else that we have is just a bonus. And Plato really lays 100%. It all out for us. And he really knew what he was doing when he did lay it out. So I think it gives us a lot of hope, and we have a lot to go off of. And I think the future is bright in this little circle of ours right now, but I think it will expand, and not just ours, but others of a similar mindset. So, yeah.
Yep. Yeah. And really that's what it's all about. The groundwork is there, and the series here is meant to encourage us that, hey, we have everything we need to get started, to build communities, and have something that is robust, traditional, and deeply aligned with Platonic principles. It's all there. The thing that's not there is doing it. We just have to get out and do it. That's really it.
Well, beautiful.
Yep. All right. Thanks, Ethan.
Yeah. Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.